Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining the Garrison Institute's live interactive webinar. Today, our guest is Ethan Nichtern and Jane Kolleeny. Ethan Nichtern is a senior teacher at the Shambhala Buddhist tradition. He's the author of the acclaimed book, The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist Path, and has recently published The Dharma of the Princess Bride, What the Coolest Fairy Tale of Our Time Can Teach Us About Buddhism and Relationships. Jane Kolleeny has been studying and practicing Buddhism since the early 70s when her teacher Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche arrived in Boulder, Colorado. Jane is in the Garrison Institute's Retreats Director and teaches at Westchester Buddhist Center. Before we begin today's session, I'll go over a few logistical items about our gathering. We're on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video are turned off. You'll only see Ethan and Jane, and for the time being, myself. For anyone unable to attend live, we are recording these sessions. You have a chance to view recordings as well as a schedule of our upcoming programs at garrisoninstitute.org. We offer these sessions free of charge as a goodwill gesture to support our community during such times of uncertainty. We would welcome donations of any amount to help us offer these sessions. Thank you. Finally, we'll have time for Q&A during this gathering. You can post your questions in the Q&A panel, which is accessible at the bottom of your screen by hovering your arrow over the Q&A button. We're on for an hour today, and we'll respond to as many questions as we can. Please forgive us if we are unable to get to your question. Thank you again, Ethan and Jane, for being with us today. And I will turn it over to you.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Jane Kolleeny, and we're very grateful that you joined us this afternoon. We thought we'd start with a very short meditation. I'm going to ring the gong, and if we could all just rest in silence for a few minutes, that would be great. Welcome everyone again. It's always nice to start with silence. I wanted to address with Ethan this period of time that all of us are experiencing, which in so many ways is like no other in the history of our lives. We are all joined in a global community to combat this predatory virus, something that none of us, I think, have ever encountered before, and hopefully will not encounter again, though that's uncertain. So it strikes me that there's some very important life lessons to learn during this time. So one theme that I've experienced is that of groundlessness, that there is a constant shifting of views about everything to do with our lives and the impact that the virus has on them. That includes the uncertainty around the number of cases, the number of deaths, whether the tests work, the availability of tests, when and to what degree quarantine will be lifted, the timing of a vaccine, the effectiveness of these protective measures. There's so much that is unknown to us, which creates a general feeling of uncertainty and unreliability in the world as we know it. So Ethan, I was wondering if you might comment on how this impacts our coping strategies, our sense of reality, and the way that we practice on the path.
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, you know, in a sense, groundlessness is such a huge part of the Buddhist teachings, as you know, Jane, and it's often talked about through the teachings on emptiness, right? Kind of not being able to solidify any experience of the self, not being able to solidify our experience of others, you know, nothing to hold on to about our view of the world, you know. And I think the way I'm feeling it right now is, and a lot of people I think are feeling it, is a real inability to predict what happens next, you know. And it's also interesting, I've been thinking about this a lot because, you know, studying a little bit of the flu of 1918, you know, which supposedly over a 2-year period killed about 3% of the human race, you know, which makes it actually the biggest single event of the 20th century. It makes it slightly bigger than World War II, but, you know, it's not really in our historical narratives very as much as other events in the 20th century. And I was thinking about that. I think we just don't know how to tell a story that doesn't have like a human enemy to it, you know? And so there's this sense of like, we're in danger, we're endangering others, it could get safe, the economy could shift or could get back to normal. Maybe where we are, New York State, will start to partially open soon. There was just a tweet I saw an hour ago from Governor Cuomo saying New York City seems on track to begin a partial reopening in a few weeks. And it's interesting what the mind does in this space of groundlessness, you know, from a Buddhist standpoint. And I think this really makes the teachings on emptiness useful. We really only have 2 narratives that we try to like hold on to our experience with. The first is the narrative of nihilism or cynicism, you could say, right? And I think a lot of us are getting very cynical in our worldview, and not because there isn't, you know, evidence of perhaps human society or our own personal experiences being in a dark place of suffering, but from a Buddhist standpoint, a cynical worldview is kind of a confused, and from the standpoint of the teachings on emptiness, confused coping strategy to deal with groundlessness. You know, in other words, what the mind is doing is saying, if I know I'm screwed, then at least I have something to hold on to, right? And the other side, which I think is common in a lot of spiritual circles, isn't so common now, but maybe is a little bit common, is the more sort of utopian or eternalistic worldview of like, just give me something solid and positive to hold on to. You know, maybe it's this sense of we are all one, or, you know, messages of we're all in it together, or, you know, we're really seeing how we're all together. So, you know, this is going to lead to great political outcomes. And, you know, 4 years from now, we're all going to live, we're going to stop polluting planet Earth, and we're all going to, you know, join hands. And, you know, as soon as it's safe, I'm going to walk down the streets of my city just hugging strangers, you know. And so I think it's the less common narrative, but there's a desire to fixate on some sort of positive certainty. And so the teachings on emptiness basically say we have to spot these storylines arising again and again, the nihilistic or the cynical narrative, and the eternalistic or the overly optimistic narrative, and just rest in groundlessness. And the thing that's hard about that is emptiness is a pretty advanced teaching. It's not really graspable, and it's based on having created the relative ground of being able to work with our mind, being able to have confidence that we can find our breath, you know, find ourselves in the present moment, feel okay about who we are, as some friends might say now, feel well resourced, you know, or that we have tools to deal with the present moment. So in a sense, it's like the whole human race is getting a kind of crash course in groundlessness, you know, and that's a great opportunity for awakening, but it's also, you know, it's incredibly scary. You know, emptiness is a space of quite a lot of fear arising, you know, and so it makes sense to have a lot of coping strategies, both our cynical worldview and our optimistic, more hopeful worldview. And so I think the practice of meditation from the standpoint of groundlessness is just to watch and appreciate how the mind goes back and forth between those extremes. You know, maybe everything's going to be okay and I'm screwed, you know, and we just watch our mind rattling back and forth between those two, and then try to come back to, here I am, I have a body, I have a breath. What can I do to help myself and maybe help others too?
Thank you. Beautiful answer. Another interesting theme right now, at least in my experience, is that of disruption. And I have no doubt in many of our lives, many people have lost their jobs. Many have lost the lives of their friends and loved ones. Many have become sick, and many have put their own well-being in harm's way in order to help others. So the habits of our daily lives have been disrupted in every possible way to a degree that we would never have imagined possible. So how does one deal with this disruption, the uncertainty, and what lessons can be learned?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that I love that word that you're using, disruption. And it's interesting to give it like a lighter touch. I think in the teachings that you know, we study and practice and teach, I would say that the best word I can think of for disruption is the word gap, the simple word gap, right? Which I think is a translation of the Tibetan word bardo, which literally means this space in between manifestations, right? So the bardo is, in classical Tibetan Buddhism, is described as sort of the space of consciousness in between death and rebirth, which mostly refers to this after the death of the body, after a human being or a sentient being dies. But it also refers to moments of disruption in our habitual patterns within this life, you know. And so you know, when you start to look, even when things feel fairly like they're going like clockwork, you know, where everybody's driving to work, you know, everybody's taking the subway, or, you know, society is functioning normally, there are these little moments of gap all the time. But then you have big moments of gap. And I think, you know, it's interesting. And the gap is considered the best opportunity for awakening, right? In the Tibetan Buddhist system, actually, like that, if you can actually hold your mind in that space and work with it, you know, the thing about a disruption is the systemic sort of patterns of our karma they have incredible momentum and a lot of force and also a lot of rigidity. So the gap is this space where we get a little wiggle room, you know. We could step out of a karmic pattern, or we could shift a karmic pattern. And so I think the first level of disruption for me is noticing what did work about our old ways, our old habits, and what didn't work, you know, because we kind of don't have a choice in a space of disruption. And I think that's both personally and, you know, socially. And I think especially socially right now, we're seeing, you know, there's a lot kind of being the sort of layers of covering how our habitual patterns worked have been sort of stripped away. And it's kind of interesting to see, you know, it's very painful to see, you know, it's very painful to see, like, you know, socially, for example, it's very painful to see how much of our old economic success is based on consumption, you know, and maybe we don't need as much stuff as we thought we did, you know. And that idea of our well-being being based on how much stuff do we go through in a given day, it's painful when you're sort of pausing a little bit that in some ways to say, oh wow, that was my pattern, that was our pattern, you know. When you pull back the sort of the degree in our society to which our systems functioned on sort of a lack of regard for one another, and how that especially affects, you know, marginalized people, Black and brown people. Like, that's the last few days as we're having this discussion, and with the rates of infection, hospitalization, death among people of color in this country, and with the police violence, etc., the George Floyd situation, what's going on in Minneapolis as we speak. Like, there's just this pulling back because of the disruption on seeing what these karmic cycles actually were. And so it's a very powerful time, and it's a very powerful time to cultivate a different aspiration, a different way of being in the world. And so I think that's, you know, that it's interesting to mix disruption with groundlessness, because as I'm thinking about my own life and talking to a lot of students, like, it's interesting because in this gap space, it's not necessarily the right time to make plans for the future. Like, oh, I'm going to change careers and become an X, because we don't really know when that's going to take effect, you know. So you can't really, because of the groundlessness, you can't really take next steps. And because of the disruption, though, we really do want to figure out different ways of being in the world, both personally and socially. And so I think it's a really good time to cultivate our intention and move towards, like, what was I doing that didn't serve, and what was I doing that, you know, from a Buddhist paradigm, like, what was I doing that didn't lead to awakening or didn't lead to benefiting others? And rather than blaming myself or blaming others for that matter, can I just actually take responsibility that that's the karmic cycle I was in, and see if I can set an intention to shift. You know, the classic teachings on karma really talk about intention quite a lot, and that's why right intention is right at the beginning of, like, the Eightfold Path, to really just say, like, is there a different way that I could, you know, like, if my intention could be something as simple as, like, my intention is to be more present with my family, which means less time on my phone, you know, that would be a very simple intention to try to cultivate, right? And a very personal one that also has social effects. So I think the disruption leads to this, and the groundlessness lead to a gap space, which make it a hard time to make plans, but a really good time to cultivate intention.
Thank you. That's wonderful. I wanted to also talk a little bit about the isolation that all of us are experiencing being in quarantine, being at home, sheltering in place. For some people, it's a time of possible depression, while others might find that it's a powerful lesson in the value of a life lived with less distraction and busyness. So there's sort of two ways that this can go, and often it goes in both directions at once. And how might that impact our view of life going forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful question, and yeah, to me, you're really hitting all the notes of what the folks I'm talking to in my own experience of what's happening right now. I just say the isolation piece is interesting because I do find that there's kind of two groups on this. Some people I know are fully isolated, which means they're sheltering in place alone, meaning they are the only human being, sometimes the only, if they don't have pets, like really alone. And some people are in a partner or family retreat, for lack of a better word, in terms of the shelter in place. And I think these two have different qualities of isolation. One has the quality of, I'm really working with my own mind and my own experience of aloneness. And the other has more of a quality of like, oh, I'm working with irritation, claustrophobia, really seeing myself, seeing, my partner or children or, other roommates, very kind of in a very raw way, in a very repetitive kind of Groundhog's Day way. But either way, I think we are forced into this because we can't just escape. I mean, we can go on, a wonderful Zoom, that Garrison Institute is hosting, and that can give us some sense of connection. But everybody I know is saying like, oh, maybe Zoom is a good way to do some things, but it's not the same as like actual human connection. So I think we are all forced into, what I think Chögyam Trungpa called aloneness, which is a lot of what meditation is about, of like just really confronting yourself. I think it was him who distinguished between aloneness and loneliness. The quality of aloneness, as I understand it, was just the experience of really being, the bravery of being with oneself, and from a certain standpoint, realizing we are always alone. I mean, that's part of the Dharma, and part of the meditation is you actually realize like, it's just me here with, my sensations, my emotions, my thoughts, that's that, and my awareness, and that's what being human is. It's just like me. And then I bounce that off of what seems to be other sentient beings, but that's the odd part. You can't ever really know another being's experience, so from that standpoint, aloneness and meditation, you're really like, oh, it's nobody here but nobody else on the bus. I'm the driver and the passenger, and so I think there's a tenderness to that, because it's kind of heartbreaking to realize that you're alone with yourself, but there's also a real strength or bravery or fearlessness to that, and saying like, okay, I can work with my own mind. And then the loneliness aspect, as my understanding, is what the experience of not actually wanting to work with aloneness. And so you kind of are constantly grasping on to trying to get validation from other sentient beings. We're almost like hungry ghosts towards others, and I think we live in an era where this kind of the loneliness aspect has been sort of embedded in every social platform that we use. I remember reading the work of the researcher and Dharma teacher and psychologist Judson Brewer, talking about studies that they did about what Facebook or social media does to our brains. And it actually enlarges, I believe it's a part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, like they can tell how much time we spend online, because this part of the brain that's about seeking validation from others lights up more and more. And that's what all those likes are, you know, and that sort of faux connection of wanting to be not just connected with, not just loved and love others, but wanting to be validated by others. And so I think it's a powerful time to see our grasping from loneliness. But I also think, you know, we all need, you know, I think there's a basic approach in Buddhism, you know, the Sangha is incredibly important. And I think we sometimes diminish the importance of community and friends. Like Buddhism really is I get by with a little help from my friends tradition. Like we need support from others, you know, we not grasping support, but so I think, you know, how, if you're really feeling the isolation as a depressive state, you know, it's a real sign to reach out for support from others. And there's no knock on, it's something I've had to learn, you know, as somebody who has tried to be hardcore in my aloneness since like the end of high school, when I really got into meditation, to realize like, oh no, you need support from other people. You need to be able to reach out to your teachers or colleagues or friends, or, you know, for one period in my life, my therapist, and actually like, or my parents, and say like, can we talk, you know? And so I think it's no knock on how strong we are at working with our own mind or working with our aloneness to actually make use of Sangha or reach out and say, hey, can we just talk, you know? And I think from that standpoint, these platforms at a time like this can be helpful. Not perfect, but incredibly helpful.
Thank you. Very sensitive answer. Thank you. So another interesting theme that has been very evident for me and probably others is this feeling of not being able to alter or change what is going on. You know, we're so used to changing the channel on our television or changing the environment, going somewhere other than where we are if we feel bored or frustrated. But we're unable to alter the circumstances we find ourselves in. We're at the mercy of this virus, and it's humbled us into submission. And we're also at the mercy of being stuck in what has been dictated by our governments and science, actually. So that inalterability and choicelessness has an interesting effect on our mindset. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. I mean, well, the analogy that I, you know, sometimes use, because I like it, and, you know, in classic Buddhist thought, there's a lot of analogies of like the ocean and the waves, or the sky and the clouds, you know. So, you know, I like the analogy of kind of practice, especially, you know, practice on the cushion, but then off the cushion. You know, it's like being in a sailboat, you know, so you're not, it's not like being a marathon runner. And what I mean by sailboat is like, what we're trying to do, we don't create the weather, you know, and we don't create the weather of our minds, and we don't create the kind of outer circumstances of the world. We can influence them, sure, through our practice and through our choices. But, you know, I think a lot of times people at first approach meditation like, I need to make my mind do something. And so that's why I like the sailboat analogy, because we're just trying to see how the winds blow. And kind of, you know, from the standpoint of the Chögyam Trungpa's teachings and the Shambhala teachings, you know, the notion of riding the winds, or wind horse teachings, which is this notion of like, I don't make the wind blow, but I try to ride it as best as I can. So I like that analogy of a sailboat. Like, you're trying to learn a little bit of rapport and friendship with your own sailboat, which is your mind, but you're not trying to dictate the weather, you know? And that gives us a lot of, it makes us relinquish agency, in the sense like, you can't control what happens in your life. You can't control what other people do. You can't control the larger, you know, you can't control a virus for sure. You know, you can't control your body's response to a virus, but you can work with your mind given what the weather kind of throws at you. So the way I've been describing this situation is we're tinkering, all of us are kind of tinkering with our little sailboats, you know, trying to get the sails, you know, and trying to like fix up the little bits of our sailboat, you know, and trying to do that spiritually, you know. And now a tidal wave is coming in. So like, what do I do to tinker with my sailboat or make it catch the wind? And now it's going to be completely overwhelmed by a tidal wave. So that's the way I think of this sort of inalterability or something larger than us. And I mean, you know, I have to say for myself that really the last 4 years, I mean, since the 2016 election, it's felt like something bigger and weirder, you know, and all of the events since then, and definitely now that we reach 2020, which I joke just feels like, because I'm a sci-fi fan, it feels like every sci-fi narrative at once, you know. It's like, I mean, we have murder hornets, you know. There are hornets that decapitate bees. It's like, who thought you could not think all of these different plots up, you know? So it feels like there's like multiple tidal waves, and the coronavirus being sort of the most universally felt of all of those. And we're in a little sailboat trying to figure out what to do about it. So, you know, I think it's interesting because I am like a fan of astrology, but I also wonder, based on what I just said about groundlessness and emptiness, like from the standpoint of emptiness, is like any sort of cosmology, you know, even if it feels useful, is that just another storyline? Is it just the mind trying to grasp onto, you know, oh, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, which supposedly it is, according to my astrologer friends. The two astrologer friends I talk to the most have a very positive take on what's going on now long term. They think it's the beginning of a much more positive and egalitarian era of humanity. But from a Buddhist Mahayana standpoint, that might just be the eternalist narrative that the mind tries to fixate on to not have to show up and be present with groundlessness, right? So I don't know, but it's really the beautiful thing about it is when you can actually let go. I mean, and just say, okay, there's a tidal wave coming in and I have no idea what's going on. And if whatever little things I can do to do my own practice to help those around me, you know, to in the events of the last few days and, you know, our larger society, to battle white supremacy, to be involved for a democratic and compassionate political future in the United States and planet Earth, I will do that. But I also just have to kind of like have a little bit of, you know, humor, for lack of a better word, grief, but also humor about like, wow, this is a tidal wave. And maybe I should just let go of trying to be perfect. Maybe I should just accept my little sailboat as like, this is a basically good sailboat, you know? And it's, there's some relief. There's some like moment of wakefulness that just comes from like, wow, I have no idea what's going to happen next, and I have no idea what to do about it. And it's bigger than any of us. And so I've gotten a lot of relief from thinking about like what you're calling inalterability, or the kind of scope and the real uncontrollability of outcomes here.
Yeah. Thank you. Wonderful. Well, Ethan, with that was actually all the questions that I had prepared for you. I feel very enriched by your answers. And I'm wondering if people who are joined with us right now might have some questions of their own. We'd like to encourage people to put their questions under the Q&A part of their screen. And then I can just pose those to Ethan. Okay, we have some questions. From Tamara, she's asking, can you comment on the Buddhist approach to helping people who are suffering?
That's a big question. Yeah. You mean help? I assume I'm going to answer the question, Tamara, as if you're asking the question helping other people who are suffering. In other words, not yourself. Because I think the Buddhist approach is certainly, I think, an approach of compassion, especially the Bodhisattva path, or the idea of stepping onto a path of acknowledging the interdependent situation of sentient beings, and also acknowledging that the more the Bodhisattva approach is really about acknowledging the idea that the more that we take our seat and are able to work with our own mind, the more that we are able to benefit others, and this is classically not classically, but I've heard a lot of Dharma teachers talk about this approach to benefiting others using the old airplane analogy, which now has very new connotations. Put on your own mask before helping others. That statement of working with one's own mind and then helping others has very new meaning now. So it is, I think, so Buddhist thought, I would say there's different schools, and it depends on what we need at the moment. But Buddhist thought definitely first arose as a view of like working with one's own mind. The notion that we are an individual and we can only work with our own subjective experience, and that has to be the basis of how we alleviate suffering, right? And I do think that's important. I think it can be misinterpreted, but we do have to work with our own situation, primarily because we are suffering ourselves, and also because if we try to benefit others without looking at our own mind, we often end up recreating or putting our own problems or our own confusion onto other people's experiences. So the idea of benefiting others, and from the standpoint of working with one's own experience, is really crucial. So I would say that the idea of, because we see the truth of interdependence, the idea of doing whatever we can to benefit others, and in any way we can, is exceptionally important. And then I think, 21st century Western Buddhism has a situation which classic Asian Buddhism did not have, which is the evolution of democracy, and has all of the different socio-political and identity movements of the 20th and 21st centuries. So I think part of seeing interdependence is also seeing the suffering of the social system that we live in, right? So it's not just personal suffering, it's not just interpersonal suffering, like I'm going to go help this individual person, although that's very helpful. It's also seeing how suffering can be ingrained in systems when there are confused views. So I think benefiting others is very much integral to the Buddhist teachings, and but we have to do our own practice as well. Otherwise, we tend to replicate confusion when we try to be of benefit to others. That's my thought on that matter.
Thank you. This is another question, Ethan. Can you clarify what you mean by the word emptiness, and where does identifying the object of negation fit in?
Yeah, it's this seems like it's coming from somebody who's studied a little bit of the classic Buddhist philosophy on emptiness, because the phrase object of negation is being used. So this is really important, that emptiness does not mean nothingness. It does not mean nihilism, because, as I said, a big part of emptiness is actually showing us the problem with nihilistic worldviews or overly cynical worldviews. So the way that emptiness is taught is you always have an object of negation, which means a thing which is being held on to, an experience or a worldview or a storyline that's being held on to. And then you demonstrate that it's not as solid or permanent or independent as it looks or as it's being perceived to be. So the flip side of emptiness is often called luminosity, or we could translate it as fullness. But emptiness does not mean nothingness. It's a non-solidity of experience. And so the word emptiness is about actually kind of seeing through or softening through philosophical and experiential means this mind's tendency to fixate on objects, to make either a self or a physical object or an experience or an idea about reality solid and lasting. So that's what I was trying to refer to with emptiness.
Yeah, thank you. Well said. Another question from Joanna. Joanna says she is intrigued by the difference between planning and intentionality. Mm-hmm. She'd like more, please.
Yeah, it's a subtle difference, I think, and it's a hard one to grasp, because I don't know if you've ever spent a meditation session making a to-do list. I have. I think, you know, I really like Pema Chodron once at a workshop I was at with her once received this question from the person who identified as a graduate student, and basically said, this person said, you know, I'm trying to be present, but I also need to plan for my future. Like, I need to think about future career and opportunities and where I'm going to live. And so I need to do that. So how do I be present and also plan for my future? And Pema Chodron just kind of looked at her wryly. Jane, I think you may have actually been at this workshop. I have a feeling, because it was in the city. And I remember her saying, that's interesting. Can't you just plan for the future in the present? And so I think it has a lot to do with knowing what we're trying to do. And I also think that intention has a sense of, like, intention doesn't mean like, oh, I'm going to buy these groceries tomorrow on my weekly trip to the grocery store. Intention means, like, I really want to look at how I listen to my partner, for example, or I really want to look at how I meet thoughts of self-aggression. So intention doesn't have a to-do list quality. It has more of a cultivating a kind of directionality more generally in our actions. So, but we do also need to make plans, and that's a valid practice. And what I took from Pema's answer is, if we know that we are doing that, you know, then it goes better. If we actually are choosing to say, I'm planning, right, then that's an actual practice in its own right. But intentionality is more general about how we want to meet our experience. It's like intentionality, the way I think of it is, it's almost like a highlighter pen, right? Because life starts moving really quickly. And if we set an intention to say, for example, I want to limit my mindless use of screen time right now, let's say, then what that does, if we set that intention, is the next time that we are mindlessly on our screen, we've sort of highlighted that moment, and we say, oh, right, this is the moment I was setting an intention for. I can work with it. Yeah. So that's the way I think of the difference between intention and planning. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, well said. Good example. Thank you. Here's a question from Kolleeny. She says, could you say a bit more about minding the gap?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, on one level, it's hard to say more because it's happening all the time, right? So it's really, when we're talking about minding the gap, uh, you could say it really just means resting with your awareness without fixating. But that can be a very advanced instruction. So the way I like to think about it is in the teachings on karma, this chain of karma. And the way those teachings talk about it is we come into contact with the present moment and then a feeling arises, right? So let's say, you know, to further that example, you find yourself grabbing at your device or your cell phone, right? So that's the moment of contact, and you're in the cycle of some habitual relationship to that experience. And then a feeling arises, and there the feeling would probably be one of like attraction to the device, although it could be complicated because there could also be shame or sickness with being on our screens, etc. But a feeling arises, and then if there's no gap, we just sort of respond to the feeling. You just, because it's a feeling of attraction to the device or comfort with the device, you just start looking at the device and scrolling and etc. And so the gap there is defined as resting with the feeling without reacting. That's the simplest definition of the gap. Is you make contact with the habitual experience, a feeling arises, and without reacting, you just try to rest and fully experience that feeling. So that's a great thing to do in meditation with our thoughts or emotions. And it is a great thing to do with our iPhones or our devices as well. But I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. This is from an anonymous attendee. How would you talk to a child about today's surreal world, especially a child of color? How to help with their anxiety and fears?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll be honest that I don't know that I'm necessarily, I mean, I'm a person, so, and I love children, so I'll talk to any child. I don't know that I'm the right person to talk to a child of color. I could be, depends on who the child is and what the situation is. So I think part of this is talking to anybody is knowing our relationship and kind of knowing what's being asked of us. So I think it might be more about listening. That being said, I do talk to a girl-bodied 3-year-old child every day, which is a very interesting experience. And I think a lot of this has to do with who the child is, how old they are. You know, I feel a lot of compassion. I've heard stories of people who are seniors in high school right now and are just having all of the kind of nostalgia-inducing important events of your senior year, you know, prom and graduation just wiped out, you know. So I don't know that a 17 or 18-year-old would still consider themselves a child. My daughter, you know, who's 3, she knows that people are sick. She knows we can't go to the playground right now. She wants to play doctor a lot. I don't think she understands the full implication of what's going on. So I think with an older child, though, you know, I really think it's important with anybody, but especially with kids, to meet them where they're at and assume that they are intelligent, and to not dumb things down. You know, I mean, obviously, spiritually and psychologically, we don't want to overwhelm anybody. So there is some sense of wanting to protect their experience. But I think children are really smart. And I think it's, you know, really like when the climate strike happened, most of the people around me when I was in that march here in New York City were older children, middle schoolers, high schoolers, etc. And I think they know a lot about the world, and I think it's important to just make them feel safe and protected, and that their experience matters. That is, I think, the main thing. And then, you know, also to bring out questions of what their experience of their own mind is and their experience of interdependence right now. Yeah. So those are my only thoughts. I don't know if that's helpful. But I just think presence is the most important thing with anybody, but especially with kids.
Yeah, showing up. Yeah, thank you. So we have a question from Patricia. As a sailor, I'm mindful that the captain must make decisions and give instructions to crew to keep the boat afloat. What advice do you have for someone who has a leadership role and yet is often swamped by feelings of emptiness and Bardo-like disruption?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know my own version of this feeling for sure. So I think the important part is to balance whatever you're doing to practice for self with others, you know, as much as you can. And that's really the highest aspiration that I've heard of the Bodhisattva's intention, the compassionate being, the one who has dedicated their life to compassion, is to equalize self and other, to work for the benefit of liberation of self and other. And I think, you know, one of the difficult things right now is I think one of the larger things that's happening in the world is a lot of us are really losing trust in the idea of strong leadership, right? The idea that that there are good and compassionate and wakeful leaders in the world. And, you know, I've had different experiences of that in my own life the last couple of years, and especially in my spiritual community, the Shambhala community. You know, I think the first thing to do is to actually, I think, to take care of yourself and also contemplate and feel held by other leaders. So really, like, almost like calling on your lineage, which is a huge part of the Buddhist teachings, is to really think about your own heroes in the field of leadership in whatever field you're in, Patricia and others, and to make sure you don't lose faith that flawed but skillful and compassionate leadership is real. You know, it is a very real thing. And so I think self-care is really important. And especially when you feel, because you use the word swamped, when you feel that, I think the equalizing self and other has to come back to taking care of the self, you know, and whatever your way of dealing with feeling swamped. For me, that is partially meditation practice, but it also is, you know, it might be spacing out on Netflix for one night. You know, I want to disclose too much as a teacher of Buddhism, but sometimes I just need Netflix, you know. And so that might be, if you do that with intention, it becomes a different sort of practice, you know. Sometimes I bum people out by saying, what happens if you watch Netflix while sitting in meditation posture, right? But it's a way of remembering our intention towards doing something that might just be a mind-numbing experience. And I think it's really important to think about what is actual self-care versus, you know, what is just numbing out from the disruptions of right now. But I think good leadership is a very powerful and important thing, and I'm sure that the people you work with are grateful for it, and it's really important that all of us have support, you know, especially leaders, and it's okay to be a flawed leader. You know, I think I've come to the conclusion that when a leader cannot acknowledge their own flaws, that is the only time things go awry.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. Other than daily meditation, this is from Jeff. Other than daily meditation, what are some of your other self-care rituals?
Yeah. So it depends how early I get up. A lot of days before the 3-year-old, who's now having a slight meltdown in the other room. I don't know if you can hear that, but I apologize for that, or I don't apologize for that. That's just our current state of life. you know, so doing a short yoga asana practice is very helpful to me. As I said, hanging out with my wife and watching Netflix sometimes, reading. I'm a writer. Writing has always been the chance to express myself a little bit, whether it is or isn't for an audience that might receive it, has always been part of my way of knowing myself and sort of processing my experience. So writing is a big part of my self-care ritual. Staying in the shower a little longer than normal and really feeling the water on my body, and you know, sometimes listening to music in the shower, that feels like self-care. Again, anything can be a self-care ritual if it's transformed by the intention to benefit both self and others, unless it's harmful to either self or others, right? And anything can be a way to avoid ourselves if it lacks intention. I really think that's true, including meditation. You know, we can just use our meditation to kind of zone out if it lacks intention. So I think it's important, especially as non-retreatant practitioners. You know, I don't think, since we all have access to Zoom, I don't think I'm talking to a bunch of renunciates, although there's nothing wrong with that way of viewing one's spiritual path. It's really important to look at the rituals of daily life as part of your practice. I think that's, and to welcome them that way, I think that's super crucial. So those are a few of mine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ethan. This has been a really enriching hour with you. I think Amy has some closing remarks to finish up the hour. There she is.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Jane. And thank you all for being here today. That was wonderful. Our next session is Tuesday, June 2nd with Mary Ann Best. Please keep checking garrisoninstitute.org for updated listings of future sessions and to view the recording of this webinar and others. Again, we provide these sessions free of charge. If you'd like to support this effort, please consider making a donation at garrisoninstitute.org. May everyone be happy, healthy, and safe.
Thank you.